Wiltshire, September, 1817. The evening had been arranged by Damaris Tharn with the fluency of a woman who believed preparation was a form of prophecy, and that if one arranged things correctly, the future would have the decency to comply. The Duke of Ashworth was expected at Thornfield Lodge for supper. He was unmarried. He was in need of a fortune. He had been in need of one for longer than the county knew. But Damaris knew, because Damaris had made it her particular business to know exactly what kind of trouble lived behind grand facades, and to arrive at the door with a solution before the occupant had finished admitting the problem. The solution was Lenore. Lenore Tharn, Damaris's daughter by her first marriage, 21, accomplished in the way that the word accomplished was used in Wiltshire, meaning she played the pianoforte and spoke enough French and had the kind of beauty that entered a room slightly before she did and did most of the work on her behalf. Lenore was the offering. Lenore had been dressed for this occasion since Tuesday. Elowen Tharn, Damaris's stepdaughter, had not been dressed for this occasion at all, because Elowen was not the offering. Elowen was the other daughter, the one from the first marriage, the one whose mother had died when Elowen was 9, and had left behind a library of 400 books, and a daughter who had read every one of them twice. Damaris had spent 8 years making sure this was not widely understood. Elowen sat in the corner of the drawing room at Thornfield Lodge in a dress that was clean and correct, and said nothing about money, which was not an accident, because Damaris chose her stepdaughter's wardrobe with the attention of a woman making sure something remained invisible. Elowen had her mother's journal in her lap, the small leather one with the botanical illustrations, the one she carried the way some women carried gloves. She was reading it. She was always reading something, and Damaris had long since stopped trying to prevent this and had settled instead for the more efficient strategy of making sure no one of consequence saw it. The Duke of Ashworth arrived at 7. He was 30 and carried himself with the stillness of a man who had been managing a crisis privately and had learned that stillness was more economical than performance. He was tall. He had the hands of someone who had been doing more of his own work than a duke was expected to do, and his coat was well made, but not new, which was a detail Elowen noted from the corner, because Elowen noticed what things cost with the involuntary precision of a woman who had been keeping her father's accounts since she was 14. Damaris performed the introductions with the efficiency of a woman presenting her best goods first. Lenore was offered with warmth and light, and the full social machinery of a mother who had been rehearsing this moment for 3 years. The Duke received Lenore with courtesy. He said the correct things. His attention was appropriate and measured, and gave nothing away. Damaris then gestured toward the corner where Elowen sat with her journal, and said, with the kind of smile that is only available to women who have practiced cruelty until it resembles fondness, "And this is Elowen, my husband's daughter from his first marriage. She is very quiet. We keep her occupied with small things. She cannot even read, poor dear, but she does enjoy the pictures." She laughed. It was a small, musical, perfectly calibrated laugh. 2 of the other guests smiled, because smiling at Damaris was the path of least resistance, and most people in Wiltshire had chosen it long ago. Elowen did not look up immediately. She registered the words with the same precision she brought to a row of figures that did not reconcile, the calm internal identification of an error. She had heard this lie in different clothing for 8 years, at tables and in parlors, and once in a letter, Damaris had written to a prospective governess explaining that Elowen was simple and required only supervision, not instruction. The lie had become so familiar that it had almost stopped being painful and had become instead a kind of weather, something she moved through rather than something that moved her. She looked up. She looked at Damaris, whose smile had not wavered. She looked at Lenore, who had learned to study the far wall during these moments. She looked at the Duke of Ashworth, who was watching her with an expression she had not expected. Not pity, not the polite discomfort of a man witnessing something awkward, something else, something she was going to have to categorize later because the quality of it was unfamiliar. He was looking at her hands, at the journal in her lap, at the page it was open to, which wasn't an illustration. It was her mother's handwriting, and beside it, in the margins, Elowen's own notations, small and dense, and unmistakably the work of someone who could read with considerable facility. He studied the open page for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he glanced at Damaris. Then he said nothing. He returned to the conversation with Lenore with the smooth precision of a man who had catalogued something and was not yet prepared to act on it. Elowen watched him do this. She watched him see the page, and then choose silence, and she thought, he saw. And then he chose not to speak. She was not sure yet whether this was cowardice or calculation or something else she had not accounted for. She closed the journal. She placed one hand flat over the other on its cover and held them still, the way she held them when she was composing herself into the version of Elowen that could sit in this room and be described as someone who enjoyed the pictures. She held her hands like that for the rest of the evening. The supper lasted 2 hours. Elowen spoke when spoken to, which was twice, both times by Sir Haddon Croft, an elderly neighbor who was kind in the way of people who had no interest in social hierarchies and simply talked to whoever was nearest. She answered him with the quiet precision that was her natural register, and Sir Haddon looked at her with the surprise of a man who had heard something that did not match what he had been told, and then asked her a question about the barley rotation at Thornfield Lodge, and she answered that too, accurately, because she had calculated it herself in April. The Duke did not speak to her. He spoke to Lenore and to Damaris and to Elowen's father Aldrich, who sat at the far end of the table with the quietness of a man who loved his daughter and had spent 8 years failing to protect her from his wife in ways he understood but could not seem to prevent. Elowen left the table when the ladies withdrew and stood in the drawing room with her journal and the composed stillness that Damaris had mistaken for compliance for 8 years. And that was not compliance at all, but the focused attention of a woman taking the measure of every room she entered. Waiting. In the carriage home, Aldrich sat beside her in the dark and said nothing for a 1/4 mile. Then he said, "She should not have said that." Elowen looked at the road. "She has been saying it for 8 years, Father." "I know." She heard in those 2 words the entire weight of what he knew and had not prevented, and she set it aside with the practiced care of someone who had been setting it aside since she was 11. "The Duke's estate," she said. "Ashworth Hall. The accounts are in difficulty." Her father turned to her. "How do you know that?" "His coat. His steward was dismissed in spring. The county knows that much. He has not replaced him. And tonight, when you spoke about the harvest, he asked about yield per acre, which is not a question a man asks about another man's land unless he is comparing it to a problem in his own." She paused. "The Kelsworth property, the manor and the farmland south of the Ashworth boundary. It is still for sale." Her father was quiet for a long moment. "That land borders the Duke's estate, Elowen. It is sound property at a reasonable price. The mill alone is worth the asking." She folded her hands over the journal in her lap, one over the other, flat and still. "It is a business decision, Father." Aldrich studied his daughter with the expression of a man who had watched her calculate every decision she had ever made, and had never once seen her miscalculate, and was not entirely certain this was the exception. He said nothing further. Kelsworth Manor was purchased on the 29th of September, which was 11 days after the supper at Thornfield Lodge, and faster than any property transaction in Wiltshire that year, because Elowen had her father's solicitors and her own arithmetic and the momentum of a woman who had decided something and considered delay a form of weakness. The deed was recorded in her name, not her father's. Hers. This was unusual enough in Wiltshire in 1817 to generate conversation, and it did, in the drawing rooms and morning calls, and the channels through which Wiltshire processed information it found interesting, which was to say, with the thoroughness of a county that had nothing better to do in late September and a great deal of opinion to spare. The Duke of Ashworth was informed of the purchase by his land agent, a man called Fenwick, who mentioned it during the Thursday accounts review with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information he suspected was significant. "The Kelsworth property has sold, Your Grace." The Duke set down the report he had been reading, the one about the failing drainage on the east tenancy that he could not afford to repair. "To whom?" "Miss Tharn, Your Grace. Miss Elowen Tharn. The deed was recorded Friday last." The Duke looked at the window, the south-facing one, the one that looked out over the boundary line where Ashworth land met what was now, apparently, Elowen Tharn's land. He was quiet for a moment. "The mill," he said. "Kelsworth Mill. It controls the water for the east tenancies." "Yes, Your Grace. The mill race feeds 3 of your tenant farms." Another pause. "She purchased this herself, not her father." "The deed is in her name, Your Grace." The Duke looked at the window again. He looked at it for longer than the view required. "The woman," he said, "who cannot read." Fenwick, who had been present at no supper and had no context for this remark, said nothing. The Duke returned to the drainage report and read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it, and the Thursday review continued. But something in the room had shifted in the way that rooms shift when a man has received information that does not fit the space he had made for it. Elowen was at Kelsworth by the 2nd week of October. She arrived with 2 carts of household goods, a housekeeper named Mrs. Parr, whom she had employed from Bath on the strength of a 20-minute interview and a reference that used the word unflappable, and a leather case containing her mother's journal, her father's account books, and a ledger she had started for the Kelsworth property on the day the deed was signed. She spent 5 days learning the estate the way she learned everything, by counting it. She walked every room, every outbuilding, every field boundary. She inspected the mill, which was operational but inefficient, losing water through a cracked sluice gate the previous owner had patched with timber that had no business being near water. She counted the tenant farms, 3, 2 occupied and 1 vacant, and read the lease agreements, which were unfavorable and written by someone who understood neither tenants nor arithmetic. She revised them by Friday. She was standing at the mill race on Monday morning, watching the water and making calculations in the Kelsworth ledger, when she heard the horse. He came from the Ashworth side along the boundary track at the pace of a man who had known where she was and had chosen this morning to come. He pulled up at the fence line and regarded her across it with an expression she recognized from the supper, the one that catalogued without committing. "Miss Tharn." "Your Grace." She did not close the ledger. She held it open in her hand, the pages visible, the figures visible, and met his gaze with the composure of a woman standing on her own property with her own arithmetic. He glanced at the ledger. Something moved behind the managed expression, a recognition he was not yet willing to make public, even to her. "The sluice gate," he said. "I can see from here it needs replacing." "It is being replaced," she said. "The timber arrives Thursday. I have engaged a mason for the channel wall as well. The original stonework has shifted." He surveyed the mill race, the water running through the cracked gate and onward toward his tenant farms, the farms that depended on this water, and on the woman now standing beside it, with a ledger she was not supposed to be able to read. "The water rights," he said. "The deed includes the mill race allocation to the Ashworth tenancies." "It does," she said. "I have read the deed quite carefully." She held his gaze for 1 beat longer than the practical register required. "All of it." He was still for a moment. She watched him hear what she had actually said, and watched him decide not to respond to it. "Good morning, Miss Tharn," he said. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said to his retreating back, and stood at the mill race with the ledger open in her hands, and thought about a man who had watched her stepmother call her illiterate, and had said nothing, and who had just ridden to her boundary to see for himself whether the silence had been justified. She thought, he is not sure yet. She thought, I can wait. The sluice gate was replaced on Thursday as planned, but the mason's work on the channel wall revealed a second problem, which was the kind of problem that revealed itself only when you fixed the first one. The channel wall had shifted because the foundation beneath it had been undermined by a subsidiary drainage line that ran northeast from the mill race, under the boundary fence, and onto Ashworth land. The water that fed the Duke's east tenancies was being lost underground before it reached them. The failing drainage on his farms was not a problem on his side of the boundary. It was a problem on hers. She wrote to the Duke on a Friday morning. His reply arrived Saturday in his own hand. Miss Tharn, the drainage report confirms what my land agent has suspected for 2 seasons. I would welcome an inspection of the subsidiary line at your earliest convenience. I will bring my surveyor. Ashworth. She noted that he had written it himself. She noted the absence of social formality, just the problem and the proposal and the expectation of her presence. She sent back, Monday, 8 o'clock. I will bring the channel survey. E. Tharn. Monday was cold for October, the kind of morning that clarified things. She was at the mill race at 10 minutes before 8. He was already there, on foot this time, his surveyor beside him, the drainage map rolled under his arm. He had come prepared, which she noted. He had come early, which she noted separately. They walked the subsidiary line together, from the mill race northeast to the boundary, and beyond it onto Ashworth land, where the underground channel surfaced in a drainage ditch that had been dry for 2 seasons, and that the Duke's previous steward had attributed to poor rainfall. It was not poor rainfall. It was a collapsed section of channel 40 yards south of the boundary, diverting water into the subsoil. Elowen showed him the survey. She showed him the measurements, the flow calculations, the projected loss in volume, and the cost of repair, which she had estimated to the pound. She showed him all of it in the open Kelsworth ledger, pointing to the figures with a hand that was steady and ink-stained at the right forefinger, the hand of a woman who worked with numbers the way other women worked with needlepoint. The Duke studied the figures for a long time. These calculations, he said, the flow volume, the loss estimate. You did these yourself. Yes. Your stepmother, he said, and then stopped. He was studying the ledger with an expression she had not seen before, something that had cost and recognition in it in equal measure. The repair, he said, stepping back to the practical register with visible deliberateness. It requires work on both sides of the boundary. It does. I propose a shared cost based on proportional benefit. The mill race serves Kelsworth, but 60% of the downstream volume feeds your tenancies. I would suggest a 60-40 division, your share the larger. You are proposing that I pay more. I am proposing that you pay accurately, she said. The arithmetic does not require generosity, it requires honesty. The surveyor beside him appeared to be studying the collapsed channel with considerable concentration. Miss Tharn, the Duke said, I accept your proposal. Draw up the terms and send them to me directly. Not to your land agent? To me, he said. Directly. He paused, his gaze on the ledger in her hands, the one filled with figures that were precise and fluent and unmistakably the work of someone who could do a great deal more than enjoy the pictures. You keep excellent accounts, he said. It was the first thing he had ever said to her that was not about the land, or the water, or the boundary. It was about her. She folded her hands over the ledger, one over the other, flat and still, the gesture that was her composure and her restraint, and the thing she did when something mattered more than she was prepared to show. Thank you, Your Grace, she said. I've had a great deal of practice. November in Wiltshire was a closed season. The county drew inward. The dinners contracted to the established families, and the social machinery ran on the fuel of proximity and repetition and the accumulated observations of people who had perfected the art of noticing things while appearing not to. Allawan had been received with the cautious interest of a county that did not yet know what to make of her. She was wealthy enough to be invited. She was not titled enough to be assumed. She had purchased Kelsworth Manor in her own name, which was either admirable or peculiar, depending on who was assessing it and how much sherry they had consumed. She and the Duke were at the same supper 3 times in November. The first was at the Croft House, where they exchanged one remark across the room about the channel repair, which was overheard by Lady O'Dara Beckford, who absorbed it with the alert stillness of a woman who collected information the way other women collected porcelain. The second was at the Ashworth tenants' harvest dinner, where Allawan sat 4 places from the Duke and spoke to his land agent Fenwick about flow rates for 30 minutes, aware throughout that the Duke's attention was, with a frequency she catalogued and did not examine, directed toward her. The third was at Lady O'Dara's house, where Lady O'Dara had seated them beside each other, which was either accidental or deliberate, and Allawan suspected that Lady O'Dara had not done anything accidentally since approximately 1793. They talked about the channel repair, then the winter wheat, then a treatise on agricultural drainage that Allawan had on her shelf and that the Duke had read 2 years ago, and the conversation drifted from drainage to a question he asked about her father's business in Manchester, which was the first question he had ever asked about her life, rather than her land. She answered it. He asked a second question, she thought. This is what curiosity looks like on a man who has been rationing it. Damaris, who had been watching from across the table with the focused attention of a woman whose plans were developing complications, inserted herself into their conversation with the social precision of a scalpel. "Allawan, darling," she said, with the smile that was her most reliable weapon. "You must not bore His Grace with details. I am sure His Grace would much prefer to hear about the season in Bath. Lenore has had the most wonderful reports." The Duke regarded Damaris with the expression Allawan had seen him use on the drainage survey, the one that measured what was in front of him against what the figures actually said. "On the contrary," he said, "Miss Tharn was explaining the mill race output for the winter quarter. I find it directly relevant to my interests." He returned to Elowan. "You were saying, the sluice efficiency after the gate replacement." Damaris's smile held. It held the way a structure holds when the foundation has shifted, but the collapse has not yet become visible. She said something polite and withdrew. Lady O'Dara appeared at Allawan's elbow after the meal with the materialization of a woman who had been waiting for precisely this moment. "He corrected her," Lady O'Dara said. "He was being accurate," Allawan said. "He was being a great deal more than accurate," Lady O'Dara said. She glanced at the Duke across the room. "He has not contradicted a woman at his own social level in 3 years. Not since." She paused in the way people paused when they reached the circumstances surrounding the Duke's former steward. "In some time," she finished. "You are good with figures, Miss Tharn." "I am," Allawan said. "Damaris has been telling people otherwise for 8 years." "Yes," Lady O'Dara said. "I find it increasingly unconvincing, as, I believe, does the Duke." December brought the winter assembly at Beckford Hall. 40 people. The full county. Allawan arrived with her father, who had come down from Manchester for the month, and who stood beside her in the entrance hall with the quiet steadiness of a man who had been walking into rooms full of people who considered him beneath them for 30 years, and had built a fortune larger than any of theirs while doing it. She wore dark blue. It was cut well. It said money in the way she preferred, which was directly and without performance, and she had her mother's cameo at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she ever wore, because it was true. The evening moved as these evenings moved. Allawan talked with Sir Haddon about the winter planting. She talked with Fenwick, who had developed the habit of consulting her about water management with the respect of a professional who had identified a superior practitioner. She talked with the Duke, who appeared beside Fenwick and remained after Fenwick was called away, and they discussed a discrepancy in the East tenancy accounts that she had, without being asked, already identified the source of. That was the first time she offered him something about his own accounts unsolicited. A small thing. A figure that did not reconcile. She mentioned it the way she mentioned all financial observations, precisely and without emphasis, as though accuracy were simply the medium she operated in. Sir Osmond Price arrived at her left. She had identified him immediately as the variety of man who had inherited his opinions, along with his land, and maintained both with the same absence of effort. He was 56, a baronet, Wiltshire since birth, and he considered this a qualification for all subsequent judgments. "Miss Tharne," Sir Osmond said, with the warmth of a man about to be unkind, in a manner he considered witty. There were 5 people within hearing. He had chosen the moment. "Kelsworth is keeping you busy, I understand. One hears of improvements. The mill, the channel, all very industrious." "The mill is performing well," she said. "The sluice replacement has improved output by a third." "A third? How very specific. One does wonder whether a young woman of your, shall we say, particular background is entirely equipped for the complexities of estate management." He paused. "Your mother, God rest her, was a gentleman's daughter, I believe. But I understand from Mrs. Tharne that certain educational foundations were not entirely." Another pause. "Established." The word established did the work he had designed it to do. In his mouth, with the pause and the reference to Damaris and the smile, it meant she cannot read, and everyone in this room has heard the story. And you are trade money pretending to be landed, and I am saying this because I can. Elowen held his gaze. She drew a breath. She was preparing her response, the one she had been preparing for 8 years, the one that was composed and devastating, and hers. The Duke spoke first. "Miss Tharne," the Duke said from her right, in a voice she had not heard from him before. Not the supper voice, not the boundary voice. This voice had the weight of Ashworth Hall in it, 200 years of Wiltshire limestone, and it knew exactly what it was carrying. "Miss Tharne has identified and resolved a drainage failure that has been costing the Ashworth East tenancies a quarter of their water supply for 3 seasons. She did this through a survey and flow analysis that my own land agent described as the most thorough work he has encountered in 20 years of practice." He regarded Sir Osmond with the full, still attention that Elowen had first seen directed at her in the supper room, and that was now directed at someone else entirely. "Her educational foundations are not a subject on which second-hand reports should be considered reliable. I speak from direct observation. I would recommend the same standard to anyone offering an opinion on the matter." He held Sir Osmond's gaze for 1 beat longer than was necessary. In a room of 40 people, the silence around that additional beat was comprehensive. Sir Osmond found someone else to talk to with the expedience of a man who had been corrected by a duke in front of witnesses and required immediate distance from the sight of it. Elowen stood beside the Duke in the aftermath and thought about what had just happened, the weight of what he had said, the way he had said it, the fact that he had said it at all, breaking 3 months of careful social neutrality in this room, in front of this county, with this specificity. He did not look at her. He returned to his previous conversation, and nothing about his manner indicated that he had just done something that would be discussed at every breakfast table in Wiltshire for a week. She crossed the room to Lady O'Dara. "He intervened," Elowen said. "He did not have to." "No," Lady O'Dara said, accepting a glass from a passing footman. "He did not." "He made it about the evidence," Elowen said. "About the land?" "So that Sir Osmond had no room to reframe it as sentiment," Lady O'Dara said. "So that the room understood the position without requiring a personal declaration. And so that you were defended without being diminished." She paused. Which is a very precise kind of intelligence, and a very particular kind of regard. Elowen thought about 3 months of mill races and boundary fences, and a man who had sat at Damaris's table and watched her be called illiterate, and had said nothing, and had spent the months since accumulating evidence that the nothing had been wrong. He was silent at the supper, she said. Yes, Lady Odara said, and he has not been silent since. That distance, Miss Thorne, is not something a man travels by accident. He came to Kelsworth on a Monday morning, 4 days after the assembly, which was soon enough to mean it had been decided, and not so soon as to mean it had been impulsive, and Elowen, who understood the arithmetic of timing, noted both things. She was in the Kelsworth library when he arrived. She had converted the front parlor into a working library in October, bookshelves along the north wall, her mother's collection supplemented with volumes she had been acquiring since she had her own income, and a desk positioned by the east window where the morning light was best for accounts. She was reviewing the quarterly figures for the mill when Mrs. Parr showed him in, and she did not stand, because this was where she worked, and she was not going to rearrange herself for a visitor when she was in the middle of a column. He stood inside the door and surveyed the room, the bookshelves, the spines that showed use, the desk covered in ledgers and correspondence. He took it in with the attention of a man reading a room for what it actually said, rather than what it was arranged to say. You work here, he said, every morning. Not the drawing room. The drawing room is for guests, she said. The library is for work. She paused. You are not a guest. What am I? You are my neighbor, with whom I share a water supply and a drainage channel, and an increasingly complicated arrangement. The drawing room would be excessive. He almost smiled. She saw it happen, and not happen, the suppression of it, and she catalogued it because she catalogued everything about him now, and had stopped telling herself she did not. Mrs. Parr brought tea. He accepted it. He set the cup down and said, I owe you an apology. She waited. She did not help him. She had learned from her father that the most important thing you could do when someone was trying to be honest was to let them find the words themselves. At the supper, he said, in September, your stepmother said what she said, and I. He paused, his gaze on the desk, rather than on her, the only indication that this was costing him something. I saw the journal. I saw the page. Your handwriting. Your mother's handwriting. I knew in that moment that what she had said was a lie, and I said nothing. The room was quiet. The December morning was gray outside the window, and the mill was running, and the sound of the water was faint and constant. I have thought about that silence every week since, he said. I told myself it was not my place to contradict a woman in her own house about her own stepdaughter. I told myself several things. None of them were the reason. What was the reason? She said. He was quiet for a long time, long enough for the silence to acquire weight. 3 years ago, my steward, a man named Haldane. He had been with the estate since my father's time. He managed the accounts, all of them, the household, the tenancies, the investments, the private ledger, everything. I trusted him completely. I trusted him because my father had trusted him, and because the accounts appeared sound, and because I am not. He stopped. I am not naturally fluent with figures. Numbers require effort from me in a way that words do not. And Haldane was fluent, and I let his fluency stand in for my scrutiny, and he embezzled from the estate for 6 years. Elowen set down her pen with the deliberate care of a woman who understood what was being given to her and did not intend to handle it carelessly. How much? She said, because she was Elowen, and the first question she asked about a wound was always the one that measured it. Enough to put the estate in the position it is in now. Enough that, when I dismissed him and reviewed the books myself, I found entries I could not read. Not because they were illegible, because the system he had used to hide the losses was more sophisticated than my ability to trace it. He glanced at the ledgers on her desk, at the hands resting on either side of the Kelsworth accounts, the hands of a woman who read figures the way he read rooms. That is why I said nothing at the supper. Not because I believed your stepmother. I knew she was lying. I said nothing because you sat in that room with a journal full of handwriting and figures, and the facility was obvious, and I was afraid of the facility. The last person who was fluent with my affairs used the fluency to dismantle them. I saw your competence, and instead of seeing it for what it was, I saw the thing I was afraid of. And I let a woman lie about you in my hearing because the lie was more comfortable than what the truth required me to feel. The room was very quiet. That is what I came to say. Not that I should have spoken at the supper. That is true, but it is the smaller truth. The larger truth is that I have spent 3 years being afraid of exactly the quality I most need, and your stepmother's lie gave me permission to remain afraid, and I took it, and I am sorry. Alawan studied the man across the desk, the man who had walked into her library and handed her the interior of his accounts, not the financial ones, the personal ones, the ones that showed where the losses were and how they had accumulated and what they had cost. I understood, she said. Not at the supper. At the supper, I was angry. I was angry for 3 weeks, but when I came to Kelsworth and saw the state of the East tenancy accounts and heard that Haldane had been dismissed, but no one would say why, I understood. She met his gaze. You were not being cruel at the supper. You were being afraid. There is a significant difference, and I have had time to calculate it. I did not buy Kelsworth to punish you, she said, but I did buy it, knowing you would have to see me work. I wanted the evidence to be unavoidable. I wanted you to have to count what Damaris's lie had cost you in accurate information about who I actually am. The cost has been considerable, he said. I know. I have been keeping the tally, he said with the directness she had told herself she preferred, and was now discovering she had underestimated. You have made the case conclusively, Miss Thorne. I have no remaining grounds for the position I held. I withdraw it entirely. She folded her hands, one over the other, flat and still. But this time she felt the gesture differently. Not composure, not restraint. Something she would have to examine later, when he was gone, and the library was quiet, and she could afford to be imprecise. She unfolded her hands. She placed them flat on the desk, open, on either side of the ledger. More tea, she said. And I believe you mentioned the East tenancy discrepancy that Fenwick raised. I have the figures here, if you would like to see them. He looked at her open hands on the desk. He looked at them for a moment longer than the practical situation required. Yes, he said. I would. They spent an hour at the desk. She showed him the tenancy figures, the trail they led to in the older records from Haldane's time. She showed him how to read the entries Haldane had designed to be unreadable, the double entries, the redirected payments, the false categories. She took apart the system that had robbed him, line by line, and he watched her do it with the expression of a man seeing the thing he had been most afraid of, and finding that it was not the thing at all. You can see all of this, he said. In the figures, you can see what he did. It is not complicated, she said. It is only hidden. There is a difference. Complicated would require cleverness. This required only that no one who could read the pattern was permitted to look. He was quiet. No one was permitted to look, because I did not permit it, because I was too proud to ask for help and too wounded to trust it. Yes, she said. She did not soften it. He did not need her to. He stood. Miss Thorne, thank you, for the tea, and for the figures, and for not pretending any of this was simple. None of it is simple, she said, but it is all legible, with the right attention. He left. She sat at the desk for a long time after, with her hands open on the wood, and the cold tea, and the figures from Haldane's embezzlement spread across the surface like a language only she and now he could read. She thought about fear and facility, and a man who had just trusted her with the worst thing that had ever happened to him. She thought, the ledger he showed me today was not the financial one, it was the personal one, and he let me read every line. He returned on Thursday. This time, he brought the private ledger. She knew what it was the moment he set it on the desk. It was older than the Kelsworth ledger, leather-bound, the cover worn at the corners, in the way of a book that had been handled with frequency and anxiety in equal measure. It was the Ashworth estate's master account, the one Haldane had kept, the one the Duke had been struggling with alone for 3 years. "I would like you to look at this," he said. She understood what was being offered and what it cost, because she understood cost, and this one was not measured in pounds. "Are you certain?" she said. "I have been certain since Monday. I have been building the nerve since Monday. These are different timelines." She almost smiled. She saw him see her almost smile, and something crossed his face that she had not seen before. A relief so controlled it was nearly invisible, but present. The relief of a man who had offered the most frightening thing he possessed and had not been refused. She opened the ledger. She read it with her full attention, her finger tracing the columns, her eyes moving across the figures with the fluency that Damaris had spent 8 years denying. And that was, in this room, in this moment, the most important thing about her. She read for 20 minutes. He sat across the desk and said nothing, and the silence was not the supper silence. This silence was the kind that exists between two people who have stopped performing and are simply present in the same room, doing the truest thing they know how to do. "The loss is recoverable," she said. "Not quickly, and not without restructuring the tenancy income and renegotiating the timber contracts, which are unfavorable by approximately 15%, and redirecting the mill revenue, some of which should have been flowing to Ashworth under the original Kelsworth deed, but was diverted by Haldane through a subsidiary account that—" She stopped. "Some of the embezzled funds were routed through the Kelsworth mill accounts, before I owned them." "Yes," he said. "I discovered that in October, when you purchased the property and I reviewed the old records. You knew. You knew the mill was connected to the embezzlement, and you did not mention it. At the boundary, at the channel survey, at any point. It was not your debt. Haldane used the Kelsworth accounts without the previous owner's knowledge. The liability is Ashworth's. I was not going to make it yours." She studied the ledger, and the man who had carried this alone for 3 years and had placed it in her hands, and had also, she now understood, been protecting her from a piece of it since October. "Corwin," she said. He stilled. She had not used his name before. She had used his title and your grace and the careful distance that protocol provided. And now his name was in the Kelsworth library, and neither of them could put it back. "I bought this estate because of you," she said. "Not entirely. The property is sound, and the mill is profitable, and all of that remains true. But I bought it, knowing it was beside yours, and I told myself it was business, and I believed it for approximately 2 weeks." She looked at the ledger between them. "I was angry, and I wanted you to have to look at me, not the stepdaughter who enjoys the pictures, not the category Damaris had assigned. I wanted the evidence to be so thorough that your silence became unsustainable." "That was not a mature strategy," she said. "It was an effective one," he said. "It resulted in a drainage channel, a boundary arrangement, and the only honest set of accounts I have seen in 3 years. It resulted in you sitting in my library with your private ledger on my desk. Yes, it did." He stood and came around the desk and stood before her chair, and she stood because this was not a conversation for sitting, and they were close in the Kelsworth library, with the December light through the east window and the private ledger between them. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong before I met you, because I let a woman I did not trust inform my judgment of a woman I had not yet met. And I was wrong at the supper because I chose comfort over accuracy. And I am asking—" He stopped. He looked at her with the expression that had nothing managed in it. Nothing of the supper, nothing of the boundary fence, nothing of the man who rationed himself. I'm asking whether I'm too late to be accurate. She thought about the supper, the journal in her lap, the folded hands, the small musical laugh. She thought about the folded hands and what they had been holding in place all these months. She unfolded them. She placed her hand on his arm, flat and deliberate, the hand with the ink stain at the right forefinger, the hand that had written every figure in the Kelsworth ledger and had just read every figure in his. "You are not too late," she said. He covered her hand with his. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the clarity of a man who had spent 3 months revising a conclusion and had arrived at one he was prepared to stand behind. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to every true thing. And the library was warm, and the ledger was open on the desk, and neither of them was managing anything at all. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm. "The Ashworth accounts. The loss is recoverable. I can show you the path. You are proposing to restructure my estate finances. I am proposing to read your ledger accurately. What you do with the reading is your decision. And if my decision is that I want you to read every ledger I own, for the foreseeable future, from the adjacent desk, then you will need a second desk and better light. The library at Ashworth faces north. The positioning is inefficient." The corner of his mouth did the thing it did when he was preventing a smile. "Is that a criticism of my library?" "It is an observation, preceding a recommendation. You are going to be very difficult to share an estate with. You are going to find it considerably harder to maintain inaccurate accounts with a woman who reads them living next door. I have noticed that my inaccuracies have been performing very badly in this neighborhood. They have been performing terribly. I would recommend a complete audit. I'm in the process of one." He took her hand. "Elowen." Her name in his voice, with all of September and October and November and December in it. "Corwin," she said, and it meant everything she had not said since the supper. They were engaged by the second week of January. He asked in the Kelsworth Library on a Wednesday morning with the directness she had come to require, and she said yes with the same directness. And then she showed him the revised timber contracts she had drafted for the Ashworth estate, because the engagement did not change the fact that the contracts were due by Friday, and she was not a woman who let sentiment interfere with a deadline. He had looked at the contracts, and then at her, and said, "You are going to be a very unusual duchess." She had said, "You are going to have very accurate accounts." And that had been the proposal, and neither of them considered it lacking. Her father received the news in the Kelsworth parlor that evening. He set down the Manchester correspondence and regarded his daughter with the expression of a man who had watched her calculate this outcome since September and had been waiting with the patience of a man who trusted her arithmetic. "The Duke of Ashworth," he said, "the man who sat at Damaris's table and said nothing while she called you illiterate. He has revised that position considerably, has he? He brought me his private ledger, the estate accounts, the ones his steward embezzled from for 6 years. He placed them on my desk and asked me to read them." Her father was quiet for a moment. He understood what a private ledger meant. He had one of his own, and the number of people permitted to see it was exactly 2, himself and Elowen. "Is he good enough for you?" She thought about it with the honesty it deserved. "He is trying to be," she said. "He is a man who kept a wound as a policy, and has spent 3 months letting the policy be disproven by evidence. I find I cannot hold a man's September against him when his December is everything it should be." Her father nodded. "That is the best version of the answer." He wrote to the Duke that afternoon. The letter was brief and contained the exact dimensions of the Tharn fortune, without apology or embellishment. The Duke's reply arrived the following morning. It was addressed to Elowen. It said, "Your father's letter was thorough and entirely beside the point. I am marrying the woman who read my ledger and found the losses recoverable. The accounts will follow." See. She read it twice. She placed it in the desk drawer beside his other letters. There were 7. She went back to the timber contracts with the focused attention of a woman who was extremely pleased and was not going to be impractical about it. Lady O'Dara hosted the engagement dinner on the last Friday of January. 42 people. The full county. Elowen was seated at Corwin's right, which was where a future duchess sat, and which was also the most visible position in the room, and Lady O'Dara did not waste visibility. She wore the dark blue. Corwin sat down and said, "The blue." "It works," she said. "It does," he said. "Are you prepared for 42 opinions about our engagement?" "I have been managing rooms since I was 14. I manage them differently than most, but I manage them." "I know. I am asking for my own reassurance, not yours." Damaris was present, 8 places away, in the correct but unremarkable position of a woman whose influence had shifted under her feet. Lenore sat beside her, composed and quiet, and Elowen noted that Lenore looked not unhappy but relieved, the expression of a woman released from a campaign she had never chosen to fight. Sir Osmond Price occupied the position Lady O'Dara had assigned him, visible enough to require impeccable behavior, and far enough from Elowen to prevent any repetition of December. Damaris congratulated them during the drawing room after, with the composure of a woman who had no remaining options and was executing the only strategy left available to her, which was grace. She said the correct things. She said them to Corwin first, and then to Elowen. When she said them to Elowen, she met her stepdaughter's eyes, and what passed between them was not warmth and was not hostility. It was the acknowledgement of 2 women who understood exactly what had happened, and what it had cost, and what it now meant. "I wish you happiness," Damaris said. "Thank you," Elowen said, and the transaction was complete. Her father found her at the edge of the room near the end of the evening. "Well," he said. She looked at Corwin across the room, managing the occasion with the precision of a man who had been doing this since he was 22, but doing it tonight with a quality she had not seen before, a lightness, small but real, the lightness of a man whose private ledger was no longer private in the way that had been killing him. "He is happy," she said. "Are you?" "I am. I am also still irritated about 3 things he said in November about the mill race allocation, and I intend to revisit them at the appropriate time." Her father laughed, the full, real laugh of a man who had spent 22 years being proud of this person and was letting it show. "You are going to be a magnificent duchess." "I know," she said. "The accounts will be impeccable." They were married in February at the church in the village between the Ashworth and Kelsworth estates, which was geographically practical and architecturally beautiful, and Elowen had noted both of these qualities when she first saw it in October, and had filed them under future reference without admitting what future she was referencing. She wore dark blue. Corwin was not surprised. Lady O'Dara was not surprised. Her father simply nodded. The county came, 40 people from the engagement dinner, and a number beyond, because the marriage of a duke was an occasion, and the marriage of this duke to this woman was an occasion with the additional quality of a story the county had been following since September. Elowen walked in on her father's arm and thought about the supper at Thornfield Lodge, and the woman who had sat in the corner with a journal and folded hands and had been introduced as someone who enjoyed the pictures. She thought about every version of the hands. The first, at the supper. One hand flat over the other on the journal's cover. "I am containing what I feel, because this room does not deserve to see it." The second, at the boundary fence. Hands folded over the open Kelsworth ledger. "I am holding my ground, and the evidence is in my hands, and I will wait." The third, in the library after the apology. Hands unfolded, placed flat and open on the desk. I am not guarding anything anymore. Come in. She had thought about the fourth version. She had decided sometime in January that it would not be folded hands at all. She reached the front of the church. Corwin stood with the full, unguarded attention, the one that had nothing of September in it. Just him. Present, looking at the woman who had bought the estate next door and fixed the drainage channel and read his private ledger and told him the losses were recoverable and who had chosen him anyway. She did not fold her hands. She extended them. Both hands. Open. Palms up and the space between them. The gesture that was the opposite of every version that had come before. Not containing, not holding ground, not even simply unguarding. Offering. I see you. I am not leaving. I am here. And my hands are open. He took them. Both of them. He held them with the grip of a man who meant what he agreed to, and he did not let go. The wedding breakfast was at Ashworth Hall. She moved through it with the ease of a woman who had been managing numbers and rooms and complicated situations since she was 14, and was now doing all three simultaneously and finding it entirely sufficient. Her father found her in the late afternoon, at the edge of the room. Well, he said. She watched Corwin across the room, talking with Fenwick and two of the tenant farmers. He is happy, she said. You said that at the engagement dinner. It bears repeating. It is the most important figure in the entire account. Corwin found her in the Ashworth Library in the late afternoon, as the winter light moved through the tall windows in the way of February evenings that did not waste their light on anything untrue. She was standing at the north-facing windows, the ones she had already told him were insufficient, surveying the room she was going to reorganize because the system had no discernible logic, and this was, to her, a form of personal offense. He crossed to the desk. He opened the top drawer. He took out the private ledger, the leather-bound one, the master accounts of the Ashworth estate, and held it out to her. This is yours, he said. She looked at the ledger. Not to review, not to consult. Yours. The accounts, the estate, the decisions. I am placing them in your hands because your hands are where they belong, and I should have known that in September, and I know it now, and I want it in the record. She took the ledger. She held it in both hands, open, the way she had held her mother's journal in the corner of a drawing room, while a woman with a musical laugh told a duke that she could not even read. She opened it. She read the first page, fluently, precisely, with the complete attention of a woman who had been reading the world accurately since she was 9 years old, and had finally, after a long and improbable arithmetic, arrived at the place where the accuracy was welcomed. The timber contracts, she said, signed Friday. The East tenancy restructure. Fenwick is implementing your recommendations this week. The mill revenue reallocation. Complete, as you specified. She looked up from the ledger at the man who had placed it in her hands. Corwin. Yes. She was wrong. Damaris. About all of it. But especially about the reading. He looked at the ledger in her hands. At the woman holding it with the competence and the full unhidden facility of someone who could read everything, the figures and the losses and the man behind them. Yes, she was wrong, and you have made the correction so thoroughly that the original error is no longer visible. She closed the ledger. She held it against her chest, the way she had held her mother's journal at 9 years old, the way you hold a book that has told you something true about who you are. And then she opened it again. Because the accounts were not finished. They were never finished. There was always the next column, the next quarter, the next figure to reconcile. And that was the thing she loved about numbers, and about this man, and about the life she had purchased at market value and was going to run at a profit. The work continued. It was the best kind of promise. The February evening went on around them, short and certain, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been practical. And the answer, which they had both calculated independently and arrived at together, was that it had been, just not in the way she had told herself in September. The best investments, her father had always said, were the ones you understood better after you had made them than before. She understood this one completely, and the ledger was open, and the accounts were hers, and she could read every word.